Right, good evening ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the false start there. So welcome to the final talk in the multilingual life strand of Humanities in Public here at MMU. So this evening we will be presenting a panel discussion and it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce two friends and colleagues. So my name is Dr. Andy Harris. I work here as a lecturer in Applied Linguistics in TESOL, and I also work as the Associate Manager of the Language Centre. Huw Bell works in Applied Linguistics and TESOL, also lecturer here at MMU. And finally, our special guest for this evening is Dr. Alan Firth, who's come all the way from Newcastle on the train. Those of you familiar with the field of applied linguistics will already almost certainly know Alan's name. Alan is one of those very few rare academics who not only manages to change one aspect of his field fundamentally, but two entire aspects of the field of applied linguistics he has changed fundamentally. So it's an enormous pleasure to have Alan with us this evening. As I said earlier on, we have had a little bit of a technical problem. So Alan, instead of working from the slides he prepared earlier, is now working from an older set of slides. So we might have to ignore some of the slides that go on. So let me tell you what's going to happen this evening. Alan's going to present for about 30 minutes, something along those lines, and then we're going to open up to questions from the audience. So at that point inwards, myself, Huw, Alan will be happy to answer any questions you have, and we can continue the discussion for, well, we have approximately an hour, but since we started late, we'll probably run a little bit over time as well. All right, so without any further ado, Alan Firth.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Andy, for that very kind introduction. You know, if you could imagine one of those moments where you go to another university and you prepare your talk and everything's ready and you really feel good about this talk, and you come into the room and you connect it to an HDMI cable, and then the file that you had on your computer disappears. I had one of those moments about 10 minutes ago. I really did. It's gone. It's gone. It's inexplicable, but it's gone. So to a certain extent, I'm going to be, thinking quite quickly on my feet, but I can do that. So anyway, it's a great pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk to you about English as a lingua franca. And the reason that I think this is a particularly useful opportunity is because I think that the field of English as a lingua franca has emerged as quite a prominent field of research in its own right in the last 10 years or so. And I've had a certain role in at least the early stages of English as a lingua franca emerging. And I think what's happened recently is that the field has reached a particular juncture where maybe it's having to take stock and think about where it's going to go next. So I'd like to talk about that, and as I do that I want to narrate in a way, because I think all research is a narrative, and so I'm going to narrate what I think happened sort of in the last 20 years. And sometimes I will look at the file, the PowerPoint, and sometimes I'll just talk off my notes. So I'd like to talk first about the origins of English as a lingua franca, because I think I think one can say that in the 1980s there was a very important publication that was produced by Braj Kachru, whose name is on the slide there. And in 1984 he wrote a very important book called The Alchemy of English. And in that book he introduced the notion of the three concentric circles. And he talks about English. He said we need to reconceptualize English, the English language, and the way that we see the English language. He said that we could see it in terms of three circles. One is what he called the inner circle. This is occupied by native speakers of English in places like the UK, Canada, Australia, the United States, and so on. And then outside that inner circle, there was an outer circle, as he called it, where we would have countries such as India, Pakistan, Kenya, Singapore. This is the outer circle. And then beyond that would be the expanding circle, as he called it. So you've got these three circles. And Cattrew introduced this idea that we have not one English, but different Englishes. And he came up with this, this term, world Englishes, which many people didn't like at the time. But he said that the outer circle, this is countries like India, Pakistan, Kenya and so on, these countries claimed Cattrew were endonormative. In other words, they could come up with their own Englishes rather than be looking to first language countries as the arbiters of standards of correctness. He said places like India, Singapore, Pakistan could legitimately claim to form their own Englishes. Well, I think this, in many ways, was a reflection of a turn in applied linguistics. Some have called it a social turn. David Block, in a book he published in 2003, he talks about the social turn in second language acquisition. And during this particular time in the 1980s, there was a feeling, I think, that the way that English had been approached was too native speaker centric. You could say that. And this was certainly the argument that Cattrew had forwarded. We were too preoccupied with asserting the ascendancy of the native speaker of English. And this no longer reflected the sociolinguistic reality of English which was becoming more and more clearly the world's lingua franca, you might say. And so there was another important series of publications in the 1980s, which in a sense piggybacked on to Cattrew's ideas. These were by people like Larry Smith and Randolph Quirk, who proposed another form of English. They called it international English. And this should replace English as a native tongue as the model to be taught by English language teachers. International English, said Smith and Quirk, could be a simplified form of English that foreigners would learn, and it would be devoid of silly things like idioms and contractions and all these things which make it more complicated than it needs to be. This idea never really took off, but I think it nevertheless it was becoming aware to more and more researchers that there were stirrings within the ELT community about the theoretical status of English within applied linguistics. Alan Davis, then in the late 1980s, he wrote The Native Speaker in Applied Linguistics, where he also questioned the unquestioned ascendancy of the native speaker in applied linguistics, and said, we really need to do something about this. Then I think another, well, certainly for me anyway, there was I wrote an article in 1990 at the age of 10, actually, and in that article I was looking at research in non-native speakers interacting in English. And most of this research at the time, this is in the late 80s, most of the research was done by people like Mike Long and Veronis and Gass, for example, and Diane Larson-Freeman. These were important scholars, and what they were doing was they were insisting that in order to improve our understanding of how people learn English as a second language, we need to give them opportunities to interact in English. And so they were collecting data based on samples which were involving non-native speakers and non-native speakers. So you had this kind of small paradigm called non-native speaker interactions. And the idea being that these people were learners of English. Well, I collected some data at that time. I was doing my PhD, and I collected data of people who were interacting in English, but they were not learners, but they were using English as a second language. They were at work in various workplaces. I was collecting my data in Denmark at the time. And I had a real issue. At that particular time, I was actually studying in Hawaii with Mike Long. And I told him that I had a real problem referring to these interactions as non-native speakers, non-native speakers. And he didn't really understand why. And I said, wouldn't it be like calling a woman a non-man? You know, I said, why are we doing this? Isn't it sort of emphasising, you know, the fact that they are not something? We're defining someone in terms of what they are not, a non-native speaker. And doesn't that carry with it a certain ideology? Doesn't it? Isn't it sort of built on a set of assumptions? If you're referring to someone as a non-native speaker, isn't that built? Doesn't that come with a set of assumptions which, in some ways, are rather chauvinistic, you might say? In that one unquestionably associates non-nativeness with something that's lacking, or, you know, L2 with something that's lacking. And so, as an alternative to non-native speaker, I said that maybe we could call it something else. Instead of non-native, non-native. He said, what do you want to call it? And I said, how about lingua franca? We could call it lingua franca interactions. And what I was trying to do there was try and shift the emphasis, the theoretical emphasis. What you call something is important. The labels that we give things, the names that we give to concepts are really important. And I was simply trying to say, maybe we could change the shift, we could change the emphasis, change the angle of perception on these particular types of interactions. And then once you push that domino, then a series of dominoes begin to fall, I think. So I wrote this paper, and I think it was the first. Article that came out where I was looking at interactions in what I called English as a lingua franca. And the response I got to that was deafening silence. Nobody took a blind bit of notice. Why should they, after all? Right? I was 10 years old. So anyway, I had another go a few years later. In 1996, I wrote another paper. I tried again. I wrote about English as a lingua franca, and I was a bit more confident this time, because I knew that people were they felt that something resonated in the applied linguistic community with these ideas, with this kind of deconstructing the idea of a non-native speaker. And all the assumptions and theories that go with that needed, I think, to be addressed. At that particular time, there were some really interesting critiques of SLA, second language acquisition, in prominent journals such as Applied Linguistics. Candlin and Breen in the 1980s had published a very important critique of SLA. And in 1996, David Block had also published an important critique. So this is what happens. Right. Jim, he'll come back to me. There was another paper anyway, The Letting All the Flowers Bloom. Does anyone remember that article? Lantol, was it? Thank you, Andrew. So there was this kind of growing critique of SLA, second language acquisition. Second language acquisition at that time was very much the kind of linchpin of applied linguistics, with very prominent scholars, very prolific scholars, working in prestigious American universities in particular. And they were becoming, I think, the object of a greater series of trenchant critiques of their native speaker-centric research agenda, which underpinned second language acquisition research. Native speaker-centric. I discussed this with some of my colleagues, and we put together a special session at the Uvescula ILA conference in 1996, where we invited some of the best scholars around, and they were very kind, and they accepted the invitation, and most of them attended this special session. And I gave this paper with Johannes Wagner, where we essentially laid into SLA. And we said that it is misguided, that it is based on questionable theoretical foundations, that it was not a reflection of the kind of postmodern, globalized reality in which we and second language learners or second language users live. And it needed to enlarge its epistemological framework. Epistemological in the sense of what it regards as knowable or studyable. Now, it turns out that the special session that we organised, Johannes and I, was published. A series of papers in that special session were published in the Modern Language Journal in 1997 as a special issue on second language. It was called Second Language Acquisition Reconceptualized. And in that in that special issue in 1997, I think if one looks back now, that was regarded as a sort of watershed moment. I think that publication, because it clearly resonated again with the applied linguists who had this sense that there was something inherently problematic about our perception of and approach to the role of English in applied linguistics, the role of the English language, the way we treated it, the way we thought about it, the way we theorized about it. That somehow it was not reflecting the kind of sociolinguistic reality of our time. And so a series of publications began to emerge then, and I think this is where ELF, English as a Lingua Franca, began to emerge post-1997, sort of in the wake of this special issue publication in MLJ. There was a kind of a fervour with which ELF emerged as a sort of a paradigm, really, and this was led very much by the writings, the prolific writings of Jennifer Jenkins and Barbara Seidelhoff, who from the late 1990s, early 2000s, published something like 700 articles each. Well, not quite. They published a great number of articles where they clearly had been very astute in recognizing that the zeitgeist was changing, as one might say. That this was the time for a new approach to how we theorize English language in applied linguistics. And and I think what happened at that particular time was we had the emergence of a number of publications using English as a Lingua Franca in the title. A journal appeared, Journal of English as a Lingua Franca appeared. International conferences began to be staged in English as a Lingua Franca. There were master's degrees in English as a Lingua Franca. There are PhD programs in English as a Lingua Franca. Number of articles writing about English as a Lingua Franca. At this particular point, Henry Widdowson declared that the native speaker is now irrelevant in applied linguistics. Jenkins and Seidelhofer were gaining followers. It was, to all intents and purposes, the emergence of a new empire. And they were emboldened by the reception that it got, because many, as I said, many researchers, many teachers were welcoming of the ideas of deconstructing some of the kind of the foundational ideas in applied linguistics, such as the centrality of the native speaker, the centrality of standard language, standardization in language, about the fixity of language, and about the nature of competence, what that is. They, I think, in many ways empowered learners, and they empowered L2 researchers. They claimed that the expanding circle, as Cattrew referred, this is his third circle, that too was endonormative. Remember, Cattrew had said that only the outer circle was endonormative. He'd said that Cattrew had said that the very outer one, what he called the expanding circle, that was exonormative. In other words, it was dependent on the native speakers for their normativity, standards, norms, etc. Jenkins and Seidelhofer convincingly made a case that the whole world is endonormative now, kind of thing. So, Jenkins went as far as to say that English as a lingua franca is in fact a special form of English in its own right. It's a special variety. Some opined that English as a lingua franca was sui generis, that it was there for us to study and it was there for us to describe. That we could in fact, Jenkins postulated, that we may in fact be able to write a dictionary of English as a lingua franca. These were indeed bold statements. However, and this is sort of moving on to the third part of what I'm going to say, although I better hurry up, I suppose, and he's giving me the signal. Just like any other emerging paradigm, it gets its followers, it touches a raw nerve, it resonates with the research community, because it holds certain truths which are appealing, and that was absolutely the case. Don't do that. I just got my throat, so I thought that's what it does. Don't touch technology at MMU. That's the lesson for me today. Don't trust it. Don't touch it. I'm not even touching this computer. It's still the same slide on it. I'm doing it the old-fashioned way, right? However, there was, I think, a series of critiques started to emerge. Jenkins had postulated that what we could do, in fact, was come up with what she called a lingua franca core. It's a very important idea. And she said that we could, our yardstick for teachers nowadays, she said, shouldn't be comparing English with educated native speakers. That shouldn't be the model or the target. The model should be intelligibility. So get rid of the native speaker and replace it with this notion of intelligibility. Let that be the kind of the shaper of the model, you might say, intelligibility. And she suggested that we come up with this, that we work with this idea of a lingua franca core, and based on her own studies of interactions with lingua franca speakers, she said that we could, there are certain things that teachers are wasting their time with. For example, third person S, present, in the present. So, something like, he like strawberries is fine. For example, we're wasting our time trying to get learners to learn things like third person S, and a whole series of others, because those rules, said Jenkins, are non-core. So she came up with this list of what's core and what's non-core, and we should only teach the core. So this gained a lot of attention. She was giving interviews on the BBC, and she was being interviewed in Times Higher Ed and all this kind of thing. However, I think this was seen by many as a rush to reify, seeing it as in many ways she was rejecting the orthodoxy of the standard English, and yet replacing it with its own orthodoxy in seeing English as a lingua franca, as a variety in its own right. Jenkins subsequently abandoned the core idea. Prodromo, in his critique in 2008, said that it's also probably mistaken to reject the role of the native speaker. The native speaker also consists of about 400 million people in the world. So even though there are approximately 2 billion dare I say, non-natives, or L2, second language, additional language, however you want to call it, speakers of English. There's still 400 million first language speakers. So a series of critiques, and let me just try and move on to the last bit then, which is developments today, really. So we've reached a point, I think, where the idea of the Lingua Franca core has been withdrawn, where Jenkins is no longer claiming that English as a lingua franca is a variety in its own right. She's kind of given up on that one as well as the core. And I think people are seeing... There have been a number of quite important critiques. One in particular is by Kanadaraja, who his book came out in 2013, Translingual, where is it? I've got it right here. Translingual Practice, and he says that we can take the lessons from English as a lingua franca as an emerging field. We can take those ideas, but where do we need to go? We need to come up with a new applied linguistics, says Kanadaraja, because we can continue this critique of the foundational ideas which ELF has, initiated and given credence to. But where do we go next? And I think that so I think in the last few years we've had emergence of concepts such as multi-competence. We've had a range of new metaphors such as language socialization, chaos complexity, sociocultural theory. These have all been brought into applied linguistics as a way to, I think, continue this critique of the foundational ideas which ELF itself gave voice to. But I think ELF has been seen as, in a sense, necessary. It's been extremely helpful and important for applied linguists. But it's brought us to something of an impasse, because I think it's been seen as too narrow, as too simplistic in its concepts. And this is, I think, the criticism of Pennycook, Kanadaraja, that the momentum which ELF research has given has been extremely useful, but it needs fresh impetus to take it on to the next stage in its development. And so, without, I think maybe that's my main message, really. That we're at the stage now where so many ideas coming in from post-structuralism into applied linguistics that the field is, we're not quite sure what's going to happen to ELF as a field. It might even splinter even further. There are those who see themselves as ELF researchers, but who adopt different ideas to Jennifer Jenkins and Barbara Seidelhofer, whereas Jennifer Jenkins and Seidelhofer have changed their position in the last few years. So it's kind of in a state of flux, really, as a field compared to 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, where it was in the vanguard, I think, of these new ideas. So, yeah, I mean, hopefully I can say a bit more when we, engage in a discussion now. However, I think I said more or less what I wanted to say, albeit in a less slick format, because it's almost all of it has been from in here only, just in here, rather than on there as well. I'm not touching this stuff. So for now, I hope that I have been able to present to you a reasonably coherent set of ideas and narrate how I think those developments have occurred and why they've occurred, and how we've reached some kind of impasse at the moment, and where we're going to go next is, I think, a real challenge for us as educators and for language theorists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, given that we're running, if not running towards being completely out of time, do you have any questions, please? So would anybody like to ask either Alan a question or throw a question towards the rest of the panel? Please.
Something maybe you can help me with just to resolve, which seems slightly contradictory in what you're saying. That period of the mid-90s when you published your paper, you said already at that time there were other like-minded spirits who were beginning to feel uncomfortable about the whole notion of the non-native speaker. So the fact that you were met with this resounding silence seems very strange. Because one would have expected voices saying, oh, thank God someone said this, or I've been thinking the same thing myself. Or you might have had a reaction from people who wanted to defend the conservative position, saying, this is completely nonsense. But how do you interpret that just vacuous silence?
I think because, one of the things that I learned was that when you publish materials, when you publish ideas, it takes a while, it takes years, in fact, before they start to make a difference. I'm sure all of us, right, when we've published, you put so much time and effort into it, and it's published and you think, right, now, watch this, the world's going to change now, and nothing happens, right? And that's exactly what happened for me. Of course, there were these critiques, and there are a few of us who welcomed those critiques, like Green and Candlin, for example, and Lantoff's Letting All the Flowers Bloom, which was responsible of Long, who wanted to do theory culling. Lantoff said, no, let's open it up, let's get as many theories in SLA as possible. But, I mean, in my particular case, what I actually said was that critique, or my suggestion for adopting this concept of English as a lingua franca, that went back to 1990. And that met with resounding silence. Right, because I was this young whippersnapper of a lad, and it didn't really carry. But I think the article that came out in 1997, for a series of reasons, not least the prominence of the journal, particularly in American scholarship, MLJ, and the fact that it came out as a special issue, where you had a number of senior figures in SLA, not least Mike Long and Gabby Casper, who published in the same special issue. This kind of, it sort of showcased that debate, and it brought it into focus. So I think the impact of 97 was quite different from the impact of 1990. So what would you...
The contradiction between the fact that you were already speaking to a receptive audience of people that you thought were on the same wavelength, but on the other hand, complete silence.
Yeah, I mean, I think in 1990 there was definitely silence. There was nothing. I used to go around to conferences still banging on about lingua franca interactions in 93, 94, 95, but nobody really. People would politely say, that's really interesting, and that would be it. From 97, however, I think that was more of a watershed moment. That somehow touched the nerve. That changed. That was a bit of a game changer, I think. And that took about 2 or 3 years before. It was Johannes Wagner, in fact, I remember he called me up and he said, hey, do you know that article we published? That's become a hit. He said, it's like there's another special issue coming out on that particular article. So, we heard years later that even that took a while. So, because I think times had changed then. From 1990 to 1997, times had changed. There had been a kind of head of steam gathered from the number of criticisms of SLA. So, by 97, 98, 99, the field was ready to embrace those criticisms and try to do something about it. And I think what we did in that 97 article was offer something of a way forward, which was a bit of an alternative to mainstream SLA, if I may claim that in all modesty.
You talked a lot about the reaction from other researchers and other people in the field, but did you notice a reaction from the English language learners?
It's an interesting question. I mean, one of the reasons that my interests haven't been so much in terms of ELT in the last 15 years. You know, I've been working as a sort of conversation discourse analyst, working at a university, and that's where most of my attention's gone. In terms of learners, I think one can look at some of the publications that came out in the early 2000s, where teachers, you know, practicing teachers were invited to contribute to this debate, and there were certainly a number of important publications. There's a very important book called English in the World, edited by Rubdi and Saraceni in 2007, and in this book they discuss the way that ELT should be developing in light of the emergence of ELF. Namely, that, you know, testing should be changed to accommodate these new ideas, that materials should be produced to accommodate these ideas. Jenkins published a book in 2006, Attitudes, or was it Language Attitudes in English as a Lingua Franca or something like that, her second book. And she claimed, in fact, she made a very interesting claim. She conducted a survey around about 400 learners, fairly young learners. I think they were about the age of 16 to 18 in Western European countries, learners of English. And she found that the learners themselves, this is Jenkins' findings, the learners themselves were the most recalcitrant and the most reactionary. They didn't want to abandon the native speaker. So, you know, and her book deals quite interestingly with this particular challenge. But nonetheless, there was a momentum that we needed to embrace some of these ideas of dislodging the native speaker, but how that would manifest itself in terms of new materials, new testing, new forms of testing and so on, that's still a very, very live issue today. I think, however, that there has been a trickle-down effect. I know Hughes wants to, and I'm going to invite him to say something about this, because he's already told me kind of what he's going to say. But I think there has been a kind of trickle-down effect. When you go to these ELF conferences today, there's 1,000 people at these conferences. And many of them are teachers, you know, and teaching English on a day-to-day basis. And some of these ideas are beginning to percolate down into the learners, you know, because one of the main criticisms that I made in as regards SLA was that the dominant mindset of SLA is one of negativity and deficit. Namely, that we see if you were using a second language, you were almost invariably regarded as a learner. That was unquestioned, right? And I wanted to question that. But not only that, but you were seeing your language performance and your language proficiency was always compared to native speakers, educated native speakers, such that most research involved collecting, you know, if you had second language speakers, you would collect second language speaker data. This was in the 80s. But you would compare that with baseline data, which was, you know, native speakers. And then you compare, and where the differences were, you know, that reflected where you needed to do extra teaching. Right? So that whole kind of model, I think, is increasingly being questioned and challenged today. So that nowadays there are actually quite a number of important textbooks where some of these ideas people have tried to translate these theoretical ideas into pedagogical materials. You know, in terms of testing, in terms of, you know, how do we actually go about teaching then if you adopt some of these ideas? You know, how does it actually affect teaching then? And who do you want to choose?
No,
You've got some interesting ideas.
Said you're going to invite.
No, I think you should.
So yeah, that's very interesting. I take almost completely the opposite view, though, unfortunately, because I think that the rise and fall of the idea of there being this thing called English as a lingua franca. I mean, starting from basics, there's no question that English is a lingua franca, and it's the best term for it, probably, because English is used as a vehicular language across the globe, without question. As are some other languages, notably Arabic, some Spanish, perhaps, and Chinese, I suppose, as well. You can take it on a purely numbers basis and on a purely sort of like distributional spread, but nothing quite like English. So English is a lingua franca, undoubtedly. But I suppose for me, it's like the issue of what's happened with the research output of English as a lingua franca mirrors, but speeded up what happened with English, the native speaker debate. And I think the two are completely intertwined. Definitely can separate them out. And I think one of the fundamental problems is that it's become clear that the idea of native speaker, after Pikeday's book in 1985, Thomas Pikeday published his book, I can't remember what its full title is, but it's something like The Native Speaker is Dead, Conversations with Chomsky. Because of course all this sort of really heavy-duty L1 grammarian theory published in the 50s and 60s by Chomsky amongst other people and his generation depended completely on the idea of a native speaker. There was no data collected, you just consulted inside your head if you wanted to know what native speakers thought. And the Pikeday-Chomsky book sort of picks that apart, the idea that native speakers be all and end all, the native speaker is dead. But I have to say that as a native speaker I don't feel particularly dead myself. And most native speakers I know don't feel particularly dead. And I think that the native speaker is an idea which is one of those tricky things which is very, very difficult to pin down, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So, for example, for me, if someone's, I had this discussion with some of my students in TESOL 3 out there, the final year undergraduate class. What's a native speaker? We go round and round and round in circles, born in here, born there, this colour, that colour, this religion, whatever. You can't get to the bottom of it. But you can get to the bottom of it pretty simply, which is this. If you are of sound mind, and I'm only saying that because I'm not. No, I'm only saying that because it is possible to have an organic deficiency or problem which prevents you from using language, right? So, that aside, if you are monolingual, you are de facto a native speaker. You can't be anything else. There's nothing to compare you with. So, if you take two people who are both users of language, both users of the same language, let's take, for example, English, and you have one who is monolingual English and can only speak English, and treats it as the only commodity with which language can be measured, because that's what you do when you're a monolingual, right? You've got nothing to compare it with. And compare that, face that off against somebody who lives in a bilingual household, for example, as do many people around here, and myself included, in fact. They're just fundamentally different objects, but you can't get away from the fact that the point is that there is such a thing as a native speaker. The native speaker isn't dead, the native speaker is alive and well. And one of the things that native speakers very often believe is that they have a special insight into language. And this special insight comes from the fact that it's their language. And in fact, the joys of mobile technology, right? I've got a great little quotation here, well I think it's great, and it's from no less than that well-known psycholinguist, Vladimir Nabokov. I think I've just made an emergency call to the police. This is what happens when you're old and blind, I'm sorry about that. But I'll just give it to you anyway, because it's really, really interesting. As you know, Nabokov was not what you'd call a typical IELTS student, let's put it that way.
The police might want to speak to Nabokov. Thinking about his
can't get the visa. Oh well, my phone's exploded. Oh well, anyway, look, while my phone is obviously technologically jinxed this room, but basically I'll paraphrase it. I'll probably improve it in the process. Nabokov, as you know, was a Russian, born in Russia in St. Petersburg and whatever it was, and was brought up in a very wealthy family and learned to speak English, German, and various other languages from a very early age. Obviously a naturally gifted linguist. Exiled, his family was exiled by the revolution, and he went to live in, I think, Germany first, and then later in the States. And published one of the most significant and most beautifully written novels in English of any time, right? Lolita, and many, many others as well. So he's not what you call an amateur language learner. And yet, when Lolita was published, after the furore had died down, or whatever it was that had died down, he published it again with an afterword, and in the afterword he said, "My private tragedy," I'm remembering it quite well, right? Quotes, "My private tragedy, which should be my concern and nobody else's, that I've had to abandon my infinitely docile, fragile, I can't remember the exact words, native Russian tongue for a second-rate brand of English." and that I have, in doing that, lost the illusionist's power over language. Because you see, I think that everyone is in love with their own language. And people love their own language in a way that they love their own children. Because it feels like an organic part of you, even though it's not, right? If I'd been born in Spain, I'd speak Spanish. But I was born here, I'd speak English. It's just the luck of the draw. But people have this mystical attachment to their own language, and I think it's very, very hard to get around that. We can say what we like about research, and I'm not denigrating it at all. And I've got a lot of time for the way in which the EFL native speaker centrist apple cart has been upset. And I don't approve of, frankly, semi-racist adverts asking for native speakers only. I think they're ludicrous. But equally, there is such a thing as a native speaker. He's not dead. And native speakers have this feeling that they have a certain amount of extra control and power. And other people feel that about other native speakers. So there is a, I do defer to other people. I speak really poor French, but I do defer to French people if I have a question about French. I can't help it. It wouldn't cross my mind to think that I'm actually just speaking French as a lingua franca, and I can drop their verb endings as I feel. And even if I'm in a group of people who speak French like me, and we all do it, we all defer to the French native speaker, because it's kind of like an instinctive reaction. I'm not saying it's right, but I think that's one of the explanations for why when you ask students what do you want to be like ultimately, really, they'll say, well, actually, really, what I'd really like is full control of, 30,000 idioms and full control of perfect pronunciation, and I'd really like to be able to write like Navigol, and all those things that they do say habitually. And I'd like to sound just like I was born in Bradford, whereas in fact I was born in Beijing. But what they don't say is, I'd really like to be quite slow, have a really limited vocabulary, have grammar that marks me out as a learner permanently. They don't say that. They all say they want to be native.
Well, what you're asking is a loaded question.
I know.
There's certain people who don't value those kind of levels of proficiency, because
there are some who don't.
They see English, for example, as much more of a tool rather than something they have an emotional attachment to.
No, I don't think learners do, but many learners, nonetheless, as research shows, say, well, actually I prefer native speaker teachers because they have an aspirational thing about them that I aspire to. Not all, admittedly, but it's far too many to ignore. It's simply far too many to ignore. And that evidence is in from Asia, as you say, from Western Europe, it's in from South America. It's a big database which simply can't be ignored. I think there's been a kind of, have I gone on enough now? I'll stop.
I think that's one of the criticisms, one of the very effective criticisms of this ELF movement that's been levelled at the field of English as a lingua franca, namely that it's thrown the baby out with the bathwater, to use one of those 30,000 idioms, I think you said. Maybe not quite that many.
That's 30,000 just using the phrase baby and bath.
But Kalajaraja made an interesting comment in his 2007 article. He wrote that in terms of English as a lingua franca, we're all native speakers. People who use English as a lingua franca, they're all native speakers of English as a lingua franca. I like that.
Okay, should we take a question?
Can I ask whether we're just talking about oral expression, or mostly talking about oral expression? Because I wonder where literature fits in all this. Because literature,
culture and language and culture paired together. And if you're a language learner, you generally want to learn about the culture that language comes from as well, which includes idioms and things that native speakers would know. Yeah, sorry, I was thinking the same. Sorry.
I think one of the things is it's at least partly about, we generalise. We're generalising all the time. We're generalising about people being learners. We're generalising about everybody who uses a second language as seeing themselves as a learner. Now, while that may be true in many cases, that's certainly not true in all cases. There are people who use English as well as other languages simply for certain tasks. For example, doing business on the telephone with somebody in another country. They then leave work and they don't use English at all, or any other lingua franca. So there are people in those situations. I think we have to be quite careful with. I think both sides of the coin, if you want to look at it like that, have factual parts to it. There is truth in both ends of it. There are people who aim and want to be as fluent as possible, as close to the culture as possible, etc. And those are the sorts of people often that are represented in UK universities as well. You know,
And they want to know about the culture, for example.
yeah. But there are also groups of other people who want to use any language or lingua franca for a very specific purpose. You know, they use it at work to do things at work, and they leave it there. You know, and they may be interested in learning more and doing something different with it, but they may not as well. And I think we should be careful about not assuming that everybody wants to become something that maybe we would want to become if we imagined we were them.
Can I just come back to your question then about, you know, for example, a written word? And this is a really interesting one, because most of what we've been talking about is related to spoken discourse. When we talk about writing, this opens up another series of questions. The Journal of English as a Lingua Franca is, I think, the only journal in applied linguistics. There are many journals in applied linguistics. It's the only one which actually says, it states in its editorial policy on the inside cover that it accepts manuscripts and will publish manuscripts written in English as a lingua franca. So, you know, there's, and then there have been others who, you know, will claim that, more contentiously perhaps, that, you know, their writing is in English as a lingua franca. So therefore they should perhaps be given greater leeway in terms of, you know, what we can allow them in terms of standards and, you know, rules of grammar and so on. But this is becoming, then it becomes more of a difficult issue, I think, because with writing you are detached from, you know, the recipient, right, of the written piece. Therefore, there's a greater onus, perhaps, on the writer to formulate more accurately for those reasons. But it is being discussed, I think, although nothing like as, you know, not with as much engagement as spoken. You know, all these are about speaking, really. So.
Can I ask, because obviously with writing is where we've got all our codified norms and the sort of grammar book and there's expectations of what's right and wrong, and writing has always had a higher status than speech. So in English as lingua franca, when does it become ELF, and when is it just an attested version of something that a native speaker has said? For example, so it's difficult to eat, isn't it, spaghetti? That's a perfectly normal native speaker sentence. But does a non-native speaker consider that native speaker-like, or not? I imagine not, because they've not been taught that.
There's no definitive answer to that.
Grammar.
To your
And I'm
question.
wondering, when is it something is English? When is it being classified as an English as a lingua franca term? Or
The definition of English as a lingua franca is not in terms of, it's not a linguistic matter really, not in terms of how the language is used. It's, although now of course we could then get into, you know, a deeper debate about identities, but it's a definition in terms of people who are using English as their non-first language, and that's it.
But there are people who speak English as a lingua franca then, who think they are not speaking standard English. They think they're just using it like that in order to communicate, whereas actually what they're saying is perfectly normal.
Possibly so. We don't know. That's an
And so
empirical question.
what I'm sort of saying is that we're sort of describing this and how much is the...
I don't think there's one answer to your question. There are as many, and there are, you know, it depends on who you ask and in what context they are using the language. There's not one definitive answer to that interesting question. I don't want to sort of, you know, fob you off by saying that. I just don't think that there's one way of saying there's one answer to this. I think it depends very much on the context
Yeah,
that the user is in.
I did a little bit of research on my MA, and the students would be saying, yes, I want to be like a native speaker, but they didn't consider that sentence, it's difficult to eat, isn't it, spaghetti, as a native speaker sentence. They thought it was incorrect.
Right. Whereas others, as Andy was saying, you know, certainly some of the people that I've been working with in my data collection and my data corpus, they don't really care whether it sounds like a native speaker or not. Not really. They don't have that emotional engagement in, you know, either the culture behind it or correctness or sounding like it. Some do, but some don't. Yeah, question?
Well, speaking as a non-native speaker,
And a non-man?
so I would say that it's a lot easier for a non-native speaker to communicate in English, using English as a lingua franca, with other non-native
Non-natives,
speakers.
yeah, this is often
And
reported.
the difficulty is to communicate, to understand, and be understood by native speakers. And actually, what's happening in ELD is now is focused on pronunciation and how you would be able later on to speak in a way to be understood and to understand what's going on when native speakers are actually, when
There have been quite a few studies on this about, intelligibility, and to what extent do, dare I say, L2 speakers, do they feel as though it's easier for them to make themselves understood and to understand other L2 users? But it comes back to the point that you were asking me about in terms of materials or in terms of teaching implications. One of them is that what was I saying now? What's your point about
the thing is that
Yeah,
if
sorry,
the
sorry,
model of these paradigms
Yeah.
is intelligibility,
Yeah,
then definitely the focus is on pronunciation.
yeah.
And
Well,
but this is modeling the native speaker, right?
yeah, I think I know. I remember now. What I was going to say. It was that one of the teaching implications for this is that instead of perhaps teaching the model that the native speaker is the only target, then instead it's effective communicator. Ben Rampton wrote a paper in 2005 saying the effective communicator should replace the native speaker as the model. And so in terms of teaching materials, the recommendation therefore is to prepare learners to cope with difference, rather than to teach strategies of adaptation, rather than and adapting to differences in proficiency levels of accent and so on, rather than preparing them to speak with native speakers, which used to be the case 20, 30 years ago, and maybe still is in many places.
I just want to say one little thing, and then we'll bring Derek in here as a question as well. One little thing I would say in terms of, we are talking about conversations with native speakers. Which native speakers?
That's the thing. When
I
you
mean,
adapt as a native speaker, you adapt to the standard English language.
Well, I mean, the way I'm speaking
There's more
now
than one standard.
is in no way the way that I speak to my mates in the pub. The way that a young lad who works in the docks in Liverpool or a sheep farmer from Wales, they are all native speakers, and yet if you looked at those models from either a linguistic or any other perspective, they're all different. They're all significantly different.
Except that they're all monolingual usually. Very often. That's what you're talking about, monolingual.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
However, if we're looking at a model of speech or a model of intelligibility or a model of a standard, then such a thing surely collapses very quickly once we start to look at it.
Yeah,
They also agree
they're not
in
all
terms of-
equally proficient in standard English.
Well,
So if we're
indeed,
talking
yeah.
about native speakers, then we've got an ideology about what a native speaker speaks like.
Hang on. Don't confuse native speaker done with standard English done. That's not the same thing at all. You can have two native speakers of the same language, you can't understand each other. I don't see a problem with that.
I know, but if we're saying that in terms of accent and things, when we speak in English as an L2, that we're using a native speaker model of English, whatever that model is, we have so much variation in amongst English speakers as an L1. So what can possibly be the model? And we know, well, I know of L2 English speakers who are more proficient than some L1 speakers in certain terms. So I think it's difficult to.
Traditionally, it's
describe
been
what
the
model is.
RP speaker.
Yeah.
That's traditionally been the model that we've taught to L2 learners.
Massively problematic for me and many other people in the room, I'm sure, as well. Derek?
I'm just wondering how to phrase this answer. I'm going to go for a nice version because it's late in the evening and you might misinterpret what I'm getting at. So, how are you going to enhance your mind to this? There's nothing that you said that I would disagree with, and I don't actually think, unlike you, that your position and his position are entirely incompatible. And therein lies my question. How are you going to win hearts and minds with everybody from tutors in language schools around the world to idiots in government who basically say the only cells that we should have is IELTS? How are you going to win hearts and minds? Because what you're actually saying is moving in contradistinction to the way in which UK government policy is going. And all the way down to Michael Gove taking with great delight, buying personally copies of some kind of prescriptivist idiots grammar for how to do proper English. How are we going to win hearts and minds with this? How are we going to change the way in which government, teachers, people on the street think about English? Because this is a central debate, and it's a massively central debate in at least one political party's agenda at this point in time as we run up to a general election in which 15% of people are apparently behind UKIP because the idiot of UKIP was basically saying, apologies to anybody's a UKIP supporter, but they are singularly vile. That's my professional judgment. The fact is, if somebody can sit on a train and say I'm feeling comfortable because people are not speaking my language, how are we going to enhance some minds with this? Ultimately, and this is how I was planning on coming in. What's the worth of this work?
Maybe I can throw one little thing in. I was involved in some research, well, 2 pieces of research over the last sort of 5 or 6 years with IELTS testing. And being involved in that gave me a little bit of an in to the people who talk about IELTS, the way they're changing their criteria. And one of the things that IELTS is moving away from is assessing people based on pronunciation. And I think it's at least partly due to what we're talking about. So instead of IELTS traditionally being based on a native speaker model, however we want to describe that, they're actually starting to realise that there are so many different models of PRON, that which one are you going to choose? And so rather than measuring people against a specific model, we're actually, IELTS themselves are moving away from that. Mind you, I'm not quite sure where they're at with that at the moment and how that actually works on the ground when people are actually being examined in IELTS, because that's a different question. But themselves as an organisation certainly started to move away from that a few years ago.
But that's because they're losing market share. It's a commercially driven decision.
I think the answer to your question, though, Derek, is it's going to be very, very long and a very difficult process. But the process has begun. One of the manifestations being, IELTS looking, I think, at changing their whole sort of, starting point in terms of pronunciation. There are others. I mean, the reality of the world is that most of the world's trade is done in English as lingua franca, where people are interacting not with native speakers of English, but with other non-native speakers of English. Therefore, we have to, I guess any educator should attempt to prepare and equip learners for the real world that they're going to be working in. And the real world is they're not interacting with native speakers. Now, what kind of English this produces, I'm not sure, but it doesn't sound like Nigel Farage, thankfully, let's say, but he speaks a kind of a modern RP, I suppose. I think third point is that this is beginning to trickle down, as I said, in materials production, in other testing, testing bodies that are looking at this. I mean, materials production where, for example, learners are being exposed not only to RP speakers of English, but to speakers of Chinese English, Indian English, Brazilian English, based on where they are in the world. I mean, if you're learning English in where, I don't know, in Japan, then there's a likelihood that you may, be better equipped to understand Chinese, the way Chinese speak English, if there is a particular way of speaking English in China. Or, it has to be, I think, more localised. There's certainly been arguments made for that. Kirkpatrick has been arguing for, a more localised form of, in terms of models of English, which should not be native speakers, but more accurately reflect the kind of socio-linguistic reality of the learners.
Sort of building on the UKIP bit, I just wanted to... well, no, it's a bit of a side note, but isn't a lot of this to do with power? And, you know, there were discourses valuing English, native English, and people want to learn native English because they think that empowers them, and that you know, people that support UKIP, often they're attracting disadvantaged people, and it's one of the few ways that it can empower them against the immigrant communities that are not using native English. And does this not also sort of highlight one of English's advantages over something like French, and why it's doing so much better? Because we're far more accepting of diversity across the globe. We don't assert that there is one specific, you know, best way of speaking English. That I don't value my British English any more than, you know, American English, and that in France you have institutions that say that this is the only way of speaking French, or in Japanese you can't, you know, import words without putting them in a completely different alphabet. And yeah, could you say something about that?
So what's your question?
Well, what could you comment on how you think this ties in with power within the...
Yeah, I think really it depends very much on the learner and the context they're learning in. I think perhaps if you're living in the UK and you're an L2 user of English, then the demands or the needs that you have might be quite different from someone who's learning English in Denmark or Argentina, for example. So it depends very much on the context. I think we're wrong to think that all learners all over the globe should be learning the same things for the same reasons. Those ideas have gone, I think. At least that's one of the, you know, the implication of these ideas, how they trickle down into teaching. You know, that we've acknowledged that needs differ according to, you know, do you see yourself as someone who uses English for purely, let's say, work-related, you know, or are you, you know, do you have other investments in English, more cultural, emotional, in which case, you know, your needs are going to be different.
I think there's needs and wants, because then what the student needs, what we as practitioners think, oh, the student is only going to be conversing with other non-native speakers, therefore they only need this version of it. And what they want, and they're still comparing themselves with this native speaker, and that being the ideal.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, that what students want in terms of that is by definition something they can never have. You can't learn to be a native speaker by definition.
So the native speaker does exist.
Well, yeah, I'm not certainly not arguing that the native speaker doesn't exist. No, absolutely not.
You can learn to be a native speaker.
Yeah, depends how you
It just depends what age you start. I mean,
fine.
plenty of people have by native speakerdom.
Yes, by native speaker, yeah, absolutely. But would we say that somebody who was fluent, fully fluent, however we try to describe that level of fluency, is a native speaker? I don't think most people would. I think by definition, native means to be born into a language, and therefore that in itself is part of the definition of a native speaker.
It's very problematic because that rules out 20% of the
That is my point, that is my whole point. You know, that is problematic, the construct's problematic.
But some people feel empowered just showing their identity, their national identity, their cultural identity. I think of like Zizek, for example, speaks in an exaggerated version of Slovenian.
Yeah.
Because it's part of his performance. So he feels empowered using English as lingua franca with an exaggerated version.
Absolutely,
that's
an
return to the issue of power then. I mean, Zizek could afford to speak a heavy accent
but
in English.
it's the context also that...
But I don't know how many learners of English are happy retaining their own national pronunciation.
They should be, because clarity and intelligibility should be the yardstick, shouldn't it?
But I think that there's still a very high aspirational value placed on the proficiency in the second language acquisition process that you can demonstrate through your accent or lack thereof. I mean, Zizek is a case in point, and I mean, Einstein would be another one, but I don't think that they are representative of the community of learners. So this, I think power is the core that kind of argument here, but in a range of ways, very different.
But doesn't one of the messages of the whole ELF field offer a sense of empowerment to learners in that if they, wish to keep their accent, then it's simply a historical or linguistic reflection of their background, whereas, I mean, many learners would say, I hate my accent, and instead of thinking, well, I have an accent because I have another first language. I mean, this is one of the empowering, we're talking about power, surely some of the ideas of ELF can empower learners. One of them is to escape the tyranny of this idea that having an accent is something bad. It isn't, is it? It's what, as long as you are an effective, clear communicator, that should be.
Having an accent's great.
Having an accent, we've got that.
Can I go to the back? You wait for age, then we'll come to you, Rob, and then we're going, whoever was there, this lady here. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to go back for a moment to the example of Nabokov and similar writers like Joseph Conrad, so people who wrote in English but had a different first language and were successful possibly because of that, not because they were born in another country, but because they were born from the world of metaphors or associations that were new and fresh in English when they published in that language. And there's a lot of research now about people who are bilingual and who are, as children, are, for example, more open-minded or tolerant, or people who are multilingual and are more creative. There's research into that now. So I was wondering if by putting more focus on the things that are the positive aspects of English as a lingua franca could be a bit more useful, a bit more productive than focusing on things like a set of grammar rules, which are evolving anyway, or pronunciation, which we know is already, there's more than one model, there's more than one variety, so we're not going to be able to find one. So instead of looking at the things that are divisive and prohibitive, look for something that is a benefit that we can stress when learners are struggling with, for example, things like an inferiority complex due to their accent, or when politicians that we mentioned before are using the argument of someone not being a native speaker or not being English as something negative, and again non-default going back to that definition. So basically, is it not something useful to look at the benefits first? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've emphasised the critiques of ELF, but I think, as I said, the reason that it resonated so well in the late 90s and the last 10-15 years is because it carries a message that I think we all acknowledge, that language teaching traditionally has been very native speaker centric, has been somewhat chauvinistic in terms of its insistence on a particular model, and it doesn't and traditional language teaching doesn't respond very well to this globalized world that we live in, where non-native speakers outnumber natives by about 4 or 5 to 1. So, and there are associated benefits of the attitudinal change that I think goes along with that message that ELF carries. And maybe by spending too much time talking about the pitfalls or the failings of ELF, I haven't emphasised enough there's a positive side to it. This is why it resonated so well with applied linguists in the last 10-15 years. There's a huge kernel of truth underlying that whole ELF message. Maybe it's gone too far, I think, in claiming, for example, that the native speaker is dead, or that it exists as a variety in its own right, and we should produce a dictionary of it. Maybe they've overreached.
That produces another set of again prohibitive rules, in my opinion. I wouldn't go as far.
Yeah, almost. So it wasn't really a question. It was just a comment. Firstly, to support that idea about with the accents, I think that's a really huge and important thing that people's acts. I spent quite a lot of time looking at the expression of identity through maintaining your L1 accent through learning English. You know, even though you're learning English, I think that's true for more and more learners of English now, is that they're consciously, and I think as teachers we should actually be kind of encouraging that, consciously keeping the accent, because that is part of them, it's a huge part of their identity. But also, tied to that, I don't see a problem with the idea of a native speaker model. I'm talking pronunciation, it's my particular interest. I don't see a problem with having a native speaker model, because I think there's a difference between a model and a target. And I think even an RP, and very few people speak anything close to RP anymore, but having an RP model is fine as a reference point.
Yes.
And then but that's not the target. That's not to say that people should try and speak RP, but that's a reference. And that was my big problem with Jennifer Jenkins.
Right.
By having this core, you're kind of lowering the bar again.
Absolutely.
If people kind of aim towards, they have this model in mind, even though that's not the target, they'll still kind of get here. If the model is then lowered to here, then they'll get here. And the lower down you go, the more varied the other thing, and then you'll end up with no communication.
And who is Jennifer Jenkins to say, for example, that third person S present tense is irrelevant? She can't tell people that's irrelevant.
It was a very odd list of stuff.
It was indeed.
That was based purely on her watching a few students.
Indeed, yeah.
So that's my
I think
understanding
Luke
of it.
Prodromo distills this criticism very, very clearly. Do you know his book?
I'm not pretending I do.
He spends a few chapters specifically dealing with this overreaching that Jenkins engages in. I think there's another interesting aspect here which we haven't touched on either, and that is that there are certain proficiencies. When someone said that, I think it was you said non-native speakers found that it was easier for them to communicate with other non-natives, and there's some interesting ideas underlying that, right? And it has led to some proposing that first language speakers of English should be taught a form of ELF. Not in the sense of language, language aspects, but attitudinal or communication strategies. In other words, first language speakers of English can improve their proficiency in terms of speaking English to, a more varied kind of, more varied interlocutors than first language speakers. There are many times where I've been on holiday in Spain or places like that, and a guy will go up to the bar and he'll go, I have a couple of pints and a bag of crisp cheese, mate. And the barman is, sorry, what? So it's that kind of example. I mean, there are certain, whereas others will adapt because they have the kind of communicative skills or wherewithal to adapt their language according to the fact that the interlocutor is not a first language speaker of English. We've never sort of considered that first language speakers of English could themselves learn certain communication skills, which would render them more effective international communicators.
And international communities.
Yeah,
when you live in a globalized metropolis, somehow we come to meet somebody.
Still waiting to ask a question.
Yes, so I'm not a linguist, I'm doing an MA in intercultural communication, and the way I understood English as a lingua franca, I always kind of was focused on this interaction in English between two non-native speakers. And for example, in our course we have this one native speaker, so I don't have to measure myself against kind of this whole native language thing. I'm really not concerned with that at all. But I was wondering, I'm more concerned of how do I interact with people that speak English also as a L2, and kind of for example, you said before about language and identity, and that you want to get to know English culture and that kind of stuff. But for example, I'm going to write an essay about humor in English as a lingua franca, and I'm a bit confused now because, for example, if I speak with a native speaker from England, I assume, okay, he uses an English kind of humor. I can get used to that. I kind of adapt. But what do I do if I have 5 people from different different backgrounds, and we use English as a lingua franca? But how do we pragmatics humor or politeness or this kind of stuff?
Don't tell jokes.
We shouldn't again assume that all native speakers are the same. We all adapt anyway. We mustn't fall into this trap simplifying the idea of native speakers or English people as though they're all, the same. We're not. So, I mean, we adapt anyway. We're always adapting.
Yeah, but wouldn't it then be better to kind of let go of this whole focus on native speaker English, or just kind of have a part of that, and then just bring all this kind of other stuff in, because basically English as a lingua franca is not used between, or generally not used between a native speaker and then a non-native speaker, and it's measured by this difference, but rather between people who kind of both are not like native in English and have like other things like humor or politeness, like how you be polite in English.
I think the notion of the native speaker is a very useful resource. It's a touchstone, as Rob was saying. It's a kind of a base that we can go back to. But there are certain standards that we can assume are known in common and so on. We do this anyway, but we modify and calibrate our performance or our discourse according to who it is we're interacting with. But there is an assumption that there's a certain amount of sharing happening. But then you have to actually figure out in each interaction how much is shared and how much isn't. We do this anyway.
Okay guys, we're running out of time significantly now. We've got 2 questions waiting there, so the lady behind Claire, first of all, please.
I'd like to ask your view about the future of research on English as a lingua franca, because basically I understand that you support a lot of new ideas from ELF, but you also said that at this stage that ELF research has been sort of losing momentum, and the research has been taken over, like Penny Cook or Kanagalasha, look at the multilingual, more on the multilingual rather than English-centric research. So how do you view the future of the ELF research?
I'm not sure. I
That's
really,
also my question.
I feel as though it's at a kind of a crossroads at the moment, because Jenkins and Seidelhofer really pushed the kind of pedagogic agenda and addressed their research concerns to educators, teachers, the ELT profession. But you've had more of an emergence recently of people like Penny Cook and Kanadaraja, who I think are introducing more kind of post-structural ideas and ideas from globalization. And I think this has certainly made Seidelhofer and Jenkins stop and reconsider some of their ideas. I think we recognise that Seidelhofer and Jenkins have done a huge service, I really believe so, to advancing the field and challenging applied linguists in a positive way, but they've probably overreached themselves in terms of claiming that English as a lingua franca should be treated as a variety in its own right. I think they would concede themselves that they've probably overreached. Also, this claim that the native speaker is irrelevant is also an overreaching. So, the future, I'm not. I'm crystal ball.
You did say that the field may splinter.
I think it is splintering already. I think it's splintering already. There's a very sort of sub-paradigm now, which is Jenkins and Seidelhofer and their followers, and then those who are more kind of questioning and more critical towards them. And so I think that's a clear bifurcation, of the field between the more, critical, post-structurally informed research, such as Kanadaraja and Pennycook, and Seidelhofer and Jenkins, who, are in some ways a little bit more structuralist informed. What's going to happen with those 2 directions, I'm not sure. We can look at other paradigm developments and predict that they're going to form new paradigms, sub-paradigms. There'll be post-structural ELF or something, or, there will be, just like SLA. I mean, look at SLA, that's splintered as well. So you've got more socially informed SLA researchers and those who are more cognitive. And that distinction's quite clear nowadays. 15 years ago, there was no distinction. It was SLA, really, as a more or less, united field, and it's splintered as well. I mean, the emergence of ELF is a really good example of the emergence of a paradigm and what happens when a paradigm organically emerges and then sustains critique from within. And like any paradigm, there's usually then some form of splintering. And this is what we've got here. Those splinters then form other groups, which in turn become paradigms and then become criticised and so on and so on and so on. But the foundations are there. The foundations have been laid, and but yeah, I'm not sure what's going to happen with Jennifer Jenkins' Idlehofer's ideas. They're reining their own ideas in. Jenkins has given up the idea of the core. She's given up the idea of lingua franca being a variety. She no longer wants us to produce a dictionary of English as a lingua franca. So she's changing her mind. What she's changing it to, I'm not sure.
So, ladies and gentlemen, on that note of us not knowing what's going to happen in the future, which I think is a fair place to end today, like this, thank you very much for your time and all of your input. Cheers.